Chapter 34, Survey Sickness. Roxanne could hear the sound of the glass breaking from the truck where she had been watching Tom on a small screen transmitting from Tom's secret video camera on his shirt. Thanks to Blake, they had borrowed the sophisticated surveillance equipment. She knew Tom needed help. Everyone had stopped to stare at him, and his blunder proved he didn't have much construction experience. Nervous he could be exposed, she had to get Tom out of there. Roxanne rifled through the back of the truck cab, looking for something. Anything she could use as a prop to help her. She twisted the side of her shirt into a knot and shook her hair out of its ponytail. Grabbing a folder from Tom's work bag and finding a pen in the glove compartment, she hurried out of the truck. "Yoo-hoo," she said as she entered the building. "Just come to collect a quick survey." Dressed in jeans with her t-shirt now tight around her chest, she was hoping to at least attract some attention. She worked her way to where Tom's glass fiasco occurred, noticing that someone had fetched the mustached man who was on his way. Roxanne jumped in his path, trying to cut him off from Tom. "Excuse me, sir. Do you have a moment for some quick questions? It will only take a minute, especially for someone as handsome as you." She smiled broadly, standing with her hand on her hip and her head cocked. He turned and looked at her. "Sorry, miss," he said. "Now's not the time." Roxanne considered whether she should run for it too, but she had to get Tom away. She wasn't sure what they would do if they found out he wasn't there for an honest day's work. "I'm sure you could spare a tiny moment," she smiled at him, stroking his shoulder lightly, willing him to stop. "Oh, okay, whatcha got?" He stopped. Suddenly Roxanne drew a blank. She had this idea of pretending to attract attention by asking the men about a survey, but she had no idea what to ask. "It's about beer," she said as she recovered. "What kind is your favorite?" she asked, the thought of beer making her feel a bit queasy. I like a good stout." He turned to walk away. Roxanne took a step in front of him and touched his arm, turning and smiling some more. "Great answer, but that's not all. Just a few more questions." The man seemed to be flattered by Roxanne's attention, yet she could see him trying to look behind her at the commotion surrounding the glass. Roxanne could see out of the corner of her eye that the men were starting to point fingers. She needed to hurry. "Listen, if you get everyone around, I can have everyone answer these few questions, and I promise I'll make it worth your while." One of the other men walking by heard Roxanne's pitch and stopped. She could hear one of the men behind her blaming Tom for the accident. Roxanne put 2 fingers in her mouth and gave a loud whistle. "Hey boys," she called. "Come over here with your boss. I have a few questions to ask. Leave the glass alone. It will still be there when we're through." She smiled coyly at the men who started to form a circle around her. Seeing that she had started to garner some of their attention, partially because they had already stopped work due to Tom's mistake, Roxanne stood in their circle, beaming at the crew. Her stomach churned a little, perhaps from nervousness. Like a politician at a charity event, Roxanne plastered a fake smile on her lips and shook some of the men's hands. "Thanks for your attention. Like I told your boss here." She squeezed the man's bicep. "Ooh, you're strong, boss. If you answer some questions on my survey, I can promise you won't regret it." Tom stood at the back of the crowd, and Roxanne made eye contact with him. She nodded her head toward the door. No one was standing there, but she could see Tom was nervous about trying to make an exit with the mob facing that direction. "Okay, so what's everyone's favorite beer?" The men called out various names of beer brands and Roxanne pretended to write them down in her folder. "That's great. And how many beers do you drink a week?" she asked, eyeing Tom who was inching along the back of the crowd toward the door. The men yelled out various answers and again Roxanne feigned recording them. "Now here's a big one, would you?" She tried to think of another question, but the mention of beer along with the men staring at her made her stomach feel rotten. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, the men mumbling amongst themselves. Roxanne could see that Tom still wasn't close enough to the door. They were clearly losing patience with her, and she didn't know how many more beer questions she could come up with to keep them interested. Her stomach bubbled over and she leaned over, puking right in front of the mustached man. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm really sorry." She leaned over again. Some of the men laughed, but the boss looked at her with disgust. "Morning sickness," she said. "I have to go." She looked around and saw Tom was gone. "Thank you guys. Drink more beer," Roxanne said as she waved and rushed to the truck where Tom was waiting. "What was that?" Tom asked as he drove away. "That little performance? It worked, didn't it?" Roxanne said. "I was thinking I needed to distract those guys, get you out of there. If you just ran, I'm pretty sure they would have stopped you. Luckily, our little seedling made themselves known when they did." She patted her belly. "That's the thing, Roxanne. You're pregnant. You can't put yourself at risk like that." It was fine, she waved her hand. They didn't want to hurt me. You on the other hand. You have to be careful. No more. I'm not risking you or the baby. Plus, I told you it wasn't going to work. He shook his head. It was pretty much a bust. I didn't learn anything that could help us. Tom slapped the steering wheel. Oh no. Actually, I found something we need, said Rox. Chapter 35, Trouble Brewing. I first spotted it on the camera. Then when I got in there I could see it, Roxanne said. What's that? Tom asked. They're going to brew something in there. I saw the tanks. They use them to make beer. So? Tom asked, his hands on the wheel, staring at the road. Don't you see? That's why the first question that came to mind had to do with beer. She held down her bile for a second. Sorry, the baby is not liking that. She sat back. I bet it has something to do with those clover leaf cans I've been seeing. Those cans could be from anywhere. Roxanne shook her head. I've looked online. I can't find any brand with that logo. Plus, why were they in the ash at the building Owen sent me to? Why did I find one at the police station? It's connected. I know it is. And I heard that guy mention Baxter. So he's making beer? Tom seemed apathetic. His lack of excitement surrounding the new clue bothered Roxanne. Tom, she looked at him aghast. With an illegal company? It just doesn't explain why he would be behind the stolen permit. Your building project wasn't a rival beer company. He said the words in a bored tone, his face not exposing any emotion. You're right, Roxanne hated to admit it. But I bet it has something to do with who's behind all of this. Roxanne knew there was some connection. She stared out the windshield. They had the clues, now they needed to prove Baxter was involved, and why he wanted Roxanne's building project to fail. Tom heard a ding and looked at his phone. Well, we're going to have to hold off on that. Ruby wants to meet. Roxanne sat up. Maybe she had agreed to sell Tom her land. Then their deal would work and she and her dad would be safe. She wants to meet at the symphony tonight, Tom said. The symphony? Roxanne asked. Who goes to the symphony? It'll all be fine, Tom assured her, still looking at the road. Ugh, Roxanne rolled her eyes. Music by old dead guys? Look, I just risked myself at a construction site where I didn't know anything, Tom said. Yeah, and look how well that went, Roxanne replied. This will be much easier. Just follow my lead. Like I told you. Ruby likes the finer things, but she's perfectly approachable. All right, Roxanne said. At her apartment with Tom waiting in the living room, Roxanne tried to shimmy on a tight sequin dress. She wasn't showing much, but still didn't like the tightness of the dress around her midsection. Next, she threw on a skirt and blouse ensemble that made her appear a little dowdy. When she came out in a short flower pattern number, Tom shook his head. I don't have anything to wear, she said. Something long black? Tom asked. Roxanne thought about it and returned to her closet. She pulled out a long black skirt and pale pink top. Then she threw on a black blazer. Staring at herself in the mirror, it didn't look half bad. She stepped out. How about this? Tom stood up. It's nice, he said. I don't think I tell you enough how beautiful you are. He threaded his arm around her waist. I don't think you've ever told me. Sorry. Tom looked a little hurt by her comment. I'm still learning. It's okay. She lifted her lips and they kissed. Then she pushed Tom away. Now you better go home and get cleaned up. She looked at the pants and shirt she smeared with dirt earlier. I can finish my hair and makeup here. Pick me up in an hour, she asked. While she applied eyeshadow to her lids, Roxanne thought about how she and Tom had never really had a proper date. Their first outing to the bar sort of happened by accident. Then came his baby proposal and their first kiss took place in the woods after target practice. They never got to finish their date at the coffee shop before she was kidnapped. Despite the fact that this date would include Ruby, Roxanne was excited to be out with Tom. With such a terrible track record, she craved a normal night. However, an evening at the symphony was nothing normal for Roxanne. She felt more comfortable at a rodeo than a fancy theater, and she made a mental note to use her best ladylike behavior. Tom knocked on the door as Roxanne applied a coat of lip gloss. She puckered her lips and smacked them together. On the way to the door, she grabbed her purse and slipped her feet into a pair of black pumps. This was one night where she expected to keep her shoes on. When she answered the door, Tom handed her a single pink rose. Ah, that's so nice of you, she said. He looked debonair in a black tuxedo and black bow tie. She gave him a kiss on the cheek, then took his arm and they were off to the symphony. Once at the theater, they waited for Ruby. People milled about in the lobby, most people well-dressed and looking sophisticated in Roxanne's view. Ruby waltzed into the lobby in a long champagne-colored gown. Her blonde hair swept back from her face. She looked vibrant and enchanting as Tom stared at her approaching them. Y. Glad you could join me. Her southern drawl sounded warm and friendly. I'm lucky to be here with two beautiful ladies, Tom said with a little bow. Roxanne smiled but felt a little inferior. Ruby clearly had access to a superior wardrobe, and Roxanne couldn't help but notice her dazzling teardrop diamond earrings. I like your earrings, Roxanne said to Ruby. Ah, thank you. They were my grandma's. Roxanne nodded. Her family heirlooms consisted of a rusty hammer her grandpa used, and a multicolored patchwork quilt from her grandmother. Normally, Roxanne didn't think about her lack of wealth or fancy items. Her dad provided what he could. But seeing how stunning Ruby looked amidst the crowd of high society, Roxanne felt a little out of place. Even though she was having Tom's baby, she didn't expect him to buy her expensive diamonds or clothes. What she wanted, however, was for him to look at her the way he looked at Ruby when she sashayed into the room. Shall we? Tom offered each woman an arm, and they walked into the theater to find their seats. From the first note that resonated in Roxanne's ear, she could feel the excitement in the music. She looked at Tom and squeezed his hand. Little did she know, her exuberance would set her apart. Chapter 36. Symphonic Seduction. When the first movement finished, Roxanne, overjoyed at what she just heard, clapped her hands. All the rest of the audience stayed silent, knowing that clapping in between movements was uncouth. Tom patted her knee and put his finger to his lip to indicate she needed to be quiet at that moment. Roxanne couldn't believe her faux pas. Why hadn't Tom warned her? At least when their plan included Tom going to the construction site, Roxanne had given him lessons. Where was her instruction? The next movement sounded slower, and Roxanne settled back in her seat. She liked watching the players maneuver their fingers on the keys and the strings. She pointed to one player who looked to be playing a long stick with a reed and whispered to Tom. What's that instrument? The bassoon, he said in her ear. Once the concerto was over and the audience started to clap, Roxanne clapped too. So impressed with their musical ability, she stuck her 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled like she had at the construction site. Tom put his hand on her arm to lower her fingers out of her mouth and shook his head gently. That's a little much, he said. Ruby smiled and applauded. Sorry, Roxanne said. Don't be. We all like to have a little fun, said Ruby. At intermission, they headed to the bar for drinks. Ruby and Tom enjoyed a white wine, while Roxanne sipped a juice. How are you liking it so far? Ruby asked Roxanne. It's beautiful. Thank you for inviting us, she said. My daddy used to bring me to the symphony. I even took violin lessons for a little while. It didn't take, she shook her head. But I love to hear it all put together, and then my daddy would take me for ribs afterward. Ribs? Roxanne asked, not quite believing the story. Yeah, my mama hated ribs because they're messy. So my daddy used to take me in my fancy dresses and stuff the napkin down the front. She indicated stuffing something down the cleavage of her dress. He'd do it too, so as not to get any on his tux. Our faces would be full of barbecue sauce. Ruby laughed. My dad's like that with spaghetti and meatballs. He gets it all over. Roxanne gestured, making a big mess on her chest with her hands. But the fanciest place he ever took me was the circus. I remember wearing a bright red dress and feeling so special when he bought me popcorn and peanuts. It was right after my mom left. I think he was trying to cheer us both up. Roxanne's face clouded with the memory. Tom puts his arm around Roxanne's waist. Don't worry. We'll take our child to all kinds of fun events. You know my daddy grew up on a farm. He didn't know all this finery either, Ruby said, scanning her gaze around the theater. Then she focused on Roxanne. I think he would have really liked you. Hill, I like you. She laughed and Roxanne laughed too. You've certainly had an effect on Tom, and I think my daddy would have liked to see his land go to someone so down-to-earth and fun. She turned her gaze toward Tom. Plus, I admire the kind of community you built with those shops and apartments. You're the kind of developer I think my daddy would appreciate. Roxanne looked up at Tom and her eyes brightened. He squeezed her waist a little tighter. Why don't you have your lawyer contact mine so we can work out a deal? Ruby said to Tom. We'd like that. He kissed the top of Roxanne's head and put his hand out for Ruby to shake. She looked at his hand, then drew him in for a quick hug. Roxanne hugged Ruby too. She was so happy their deal would work out and Tom could get to work on his dream development project. It all seemed to be falling into place. Their plan to develop Ruby's land looked like it would succeed. Tom would cut the loan shark in on the deal, and everyone would be happy. There was still a lot of work ahead, but for the first time in a while Roxanne believed everything would be all right. They settled into their seats for the second part of the concert. The music grew louder and more intense, heightening Roxanne's feelings of jubilation. Then it settled down, flowing smoothly, the strings easing into a calming melody. When the next section featured an upbeat tempo, Roxanne felt like she wanted to dance. After the concert they said goodnight to Ruby and walked to the car. The night air felt cool and refreshing on Roxanne's face. She gripped Tom's sleeve, happy that for the first time, they were on an official date in public without any drama or hysteria. Maybe we didn't need to have a baby together after all? Roxanne asked. Tom stopped walking. His body next to the lamppost looked identical, tall and rigid. He swept Roxanne up in his arms, carrying her like a bride over the threshold. Next he twirled around and shouted, "We're having a baby." Roxanne laughed. His sudden display of emotion was uncharacteristic of Tom, and she couldn't figure out what had set him off. He placed her on her feet carefully and held her cheeks in between his hands. "Roxanne, it's you I've always wanted. Baby or not, development deal or not, I need you. Even after I've caused you so much trouble? I mean, it's my fault you got arrested, endangered because I was kidnapped, and almost mauled by a construction crew. Don't you see?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's like Ruby said. You're the one who brought me out of my shell. You're just what I need." He kissed her passionately and she melted in his arms. That night, their lovemaking proved more intense and sensuous than before. Knowing how Tom felt about her, Roxanne shared her body more freely, letting Tom discover new areas with his fingers and lips. When he entered her, she moaned, their connection creating an overwhelming feeling of pleasure inside her. Playing her like a violin, his fingers continued to explore her neck and back. Like the crescendo of the symphony, the tension in their bodies continued to build until the final moments of cymbal-crashing ecstasy. Together they made beautiful music. Chapter 37, Movie and Mistake. With Tom busy working on his development project for Ruby's Land, Roxanne decided to try a new hobby. Tom suggested yoga to calm her and sent over a personal instructor. Layla, a thin woman in her 40s who could bend and twist like a piece of chewing gum, breezed in with her yoga mat one afternoon. In Tom's dining room, she started to show Roxanne some basic positions. Roxanne practiced reaching out her arms and keeping her hips straight, Layla instructing her into each pose. "It's important to take good breaths in prenatal yoga," Layla said, bending over and practically touching her head to the floor. Roxanne knew the practice was supposed to be relaxing, but she couldn't seem to find her zen. Instead, she worried about her former construction crew who were out of work. "Release your thoughts. Be in the moment. Reach down to touch your toes," Layla said. Roxanne did as instructed, bending over, elongating her body. She wondered about how she could get her old building project back on track. Tom's lawyer warned them not to meddle, telling them she was handling his arrest and legal case. Roxanne tried to stretch and relax, but every time she leaned over, her stomach felt like it wanted to empty its contents. Her body remained tight, not allowing Roxanne to contort the way Layla demonstrated. Frustrated, she wanted to give up. Near the end of the session, in warrior stance, Roxanne felt strong, like she could fight against the injustices Baxter had caused. Now that they'd handled things with the loan shark, she could concentrate on finding her revenge against Baxter. Her favorite part of yoga was lying on the floor on her side, relaxing after all the stretching and pretzel-like shapes Layla tried to get Roxanne to make with her body. She knew that taking care of her body and the baby inside her should be her priority, but she couldn't let go of her resentment toward Baxter. "You need to work on releasing your tension," Layla said as she rolled up her mat. "Thanks, but I'm new to this. There are going to be a lot of new things with the baby. Embrace the new," Layla said as if she were a calm, wise sage. What Roxanne wanted to do was go investigate or shoot some targets or play some pool, but Tom pleaded with Roxanne to stop those things, at least for the time being. She could tell that it was going to be a long 8 months. As Layla left, Roxanne noticed a large box sitting outside the front door. "Ooh, it's the crib." She and Tom had picked it out online. Now that Tom had been encouraging Roxanne to try some soothing prenatal activities that were anything but calming, Roxanne wanted to see how much Tom had learned from her construction tips. When Tom came home later that afternoon, Roxanne handed him a hammer and screwdriver and told him they needed to get to work. He tried to kiss her belly and tell her how much he missed her. Yet Roxanne didn't want to waste any more time. "I tried yoga. It wasn't exactly my thing," she said. "It takes some time. I read peaceful activities are good for the baby." Roxanne rolled her eyes. "You know what else is good for a baby?" she asked. "A safe place to sleep." She handed Tom the instructions for the crib. I tried yoga for you. Now it's your turn to do something new. Tom took the instructions and squinted at them while sitting on the floor of the room they had designated as the nursery. He pointed to a part on the page. What's it saying? He asked Roxanne. You need to screw that in first. She took a piece of wood from the box and pointed to one of the holes. He started assembling some pieces together, while Roxanne headed to the bathroom. When she returned, she could tell he put together one of the pieces backward. Tom's face looked exasperated as he, again, sought clarification from the instructions. You need to screw that in there. Roxanne showed him one of the pieces. Why don't you do it? I could, but then you'd never learn. He turned back to the instructions, realizing he wasn't going to win that argument with her. How about we go out for a nice dinner? I can get someone to finish this later, he said. Ooh-huh. Roxanne shook her head. Your baby. You build the crib. Remember, I'm not going to let you buy your way out of every tough situation. She sat in the rocker in the corner with her arms crossed. A pained look passed Tom's face as he picked up an Allen wrench. He continued turning the screws in the wooden boards of the crib. When Tom realized he had attached the headboard the wrong way, he threw the wrench in frustration. Even though she didn't like seeing Tom upset, she enjoyed watching his emotion. He really cared about doing a good job, but she couldn't let him flounder anymore. Here, I'll help. Roxanne took the lead and unfastened the screws where needed, assembling various parts with Tom turning screws until the crib was built. They stood and looked at the empty bed, satisfied with their handiwork. I hope raising a child isn't as hard as putting together this crib, Tom said. He draped his arm around Roxanne's shoulder. It won't be if we do it together, she said. I'm sorry for trying to make you do it all on your own, but you can't try to change me either. I like exercise that includes punching and kicking as opposed to stretching and balancing. Let's make a new deal then, Tom said, hugging his arms around her waist. I'll give you some space to do the things you want, even if I think they aren't particularly maternal, and together we do the child rearing. There's just one more thing, Roxanne said. What? Tom asked. Well, I haven't pressured you about it, but I mean It's all been so great staying here. Besides the yoga, Roxanne rolled her eyes. And I want to thank you for that. But we never really had a conversation about it. About what exactly? Tom asked. Moving in together? Roxanne asked, scrunching her face. Oh, Tom looked a little surprised. Yeah, that. His hesitation made Roxanne regret asking the question. Now that I don't need any security, she asked, trying to gauge how Tom felt about their arrangement. You can go back to your apartment if that's what you want. Tom hesitated. Then you can have your space, for kickboxing or whatever. He turned away. Sure, Roxanne said toward his back, wishing he'd look at her so she could read his face. She didn't want her own space. She wanted to be with Tom. I guess I'll drive you home? He asked, still not looking at her. Yeah, home, she said. She thought about screaming at him, telling him she wanted to stay and make his house her home. Of course she needed her own space, but she meant a closet or her own dresser, and her choice of hobbies. Not living away from Tom since the baby. She wanted Tom to ask her, beg her, plead with her to stay. When he didn't, Roxanne rode to her place in Tom's SUV in silence, and walked into her dark apartment. Chapter 38. Clover Clue. Even though Roxanne was miffed about Tom not inviting her to move in with him, she agreed to visit the bar with him in order to keep the renovations on track. In addition to a baby, they had a bar to reopen after all. Tom hired a manager who was doing most of the work, but he included Roxanne on some of the big decisions. Roxanne appreciated how much Tom listened to her ideas and valued her input. Still, Roxanne believed she should keep an eye on things at the hole in the wall herself. Despite the renovations, Roxanne made sure to keep Owen's office untouched and largely secret. She practically grew up going to the hole in the wall, following her dad around after her mother left. Owen wasn't any kind of substitute parent. Instead, he seemed more like Santa Claus, hiding out and then delivering a gift or two like a free round of beers when he was feeling generous. When Tom and Roxanne arrived at the bar the next afternoon, Roxanne looked around at some of the improvements. It appeared fresher, yet still the same old casual place she hoped the regulars would recognize. Maybe we should fix that stall in the men's bathroom. It seems to have been broken forever, said Tom. Roxanne laughed and Tom looked confused. She hadn't gone into Owen's office yet because she thought it would be too emotional. With Tom by her side, she was ready to face her feelings. She grabbed his hand and pulled him along. I have something to show you, she said. They walked into the stall with the out-of-order sign in the bathroom. Roxanne found the little knob and opened the secret door to what used to be Owen's office. Inside, she flicked the lights on. The desk in the center felt ghostly without Owen sitting behind it, looking at his papers. Owen's office. He used to sit there. Wouldn't look at you when you walked in here, just stared at his papers. Tom turned his head, noticing the surveillance screens. The office appeared orderly and empty. This is certainly a little hole in the wall. It's like a private nook. He twisted his head around on a swivel, eyeing the small room. Roxanne nodded. I can remember coming in here with my dad when I was only a little girl. He needed a favor or something. Only the regulars really close to Owen knew his office was in here. We never really knew why. She rubbed her hand across the desk, thinking about Owen. Opening the drawer to one of the filing cabinets, she peeked inside. Invoices, bills, tax returns, most of the papers were labeled and filed neatly in folders. It looks like they left you some of the supplier contracts. We can use these to reorder. I'm sure his sister took the personal stuff if there was any. Here's the liquor license. She tapped the piece of paper. She continued to dig in the cabinet until she found a folder labeled Clover Leaf. On a hunch, Roxanne extracted the file from the cabinet and paged through it. Inside, she noticed a deed for an address. The same address Owen had sent her to months ago after she told him about the stolen permit. Did Owen buy that building? How did it burn down? Roxanne wondered how the clues were all connected. What's that? Tom asked. I'm not sure, she said. She continued to scan the pages and saw an invoice. The strange thing about it was the invoice was for $10,000 and it was signed by Baxter. Seeing Baxter's name on the piece of paper startled Roxanne. It still didn't explain how everything was connected, but it was another dot on the map. Baxter, Roxanne said. How is he behind the burned-down building? What was it? They continued looking around some more when Roxanne found a few cases of beer in shiny cans with the Clover Leaf logo. It made Roxanne furious to think those cans were the last of Owen's dream of owning a brewery. All because of Baxter. Tom looked at Roxanne. I know you started all of this because you were trying to protect your dad. Roxanne nodded. I think you need to bring him in on this. You're right. They headed to Roxanne's father's place. How's my favorite mother Tobe? Her father asked before they could even walk in the door. Roxanne smiled and kissed him on the cheek. Bop. Tom walked in behind her, still a little nervous around Roxanne's father. Well, Tom, you impregnated my daughter, and we have to talk. Roxanne's father looked stern and slapped Tom hard on the back. Tom glanced at Roxanne, his face showing a small frown of concern. Have a seat. Roxanne's father indicated a space on the couch. Tom sat down, keeping his back straight and upright. I'm sorry, Mr. Gary. No one calls me Mr. Gary. Roxanne sat on the edge of the sofa, watching their interaction. I'm sorry, Tom said again. Tom, stop apologizing. Roxanne's father broke into a huge grin. I'm going to be a grandpa. He put his arm around both Tom and Roxanne's shoulders, pulling them into his chest. Roxanne smirked. Okay, Pop. We're glad you're happy, but we actually came for another reason. Tom, a little relieved, relaxed his shoulders a bit. What's up, Roxy? Her father asked. You know how I told you Tom bought the hole in the wall? Just another reason why I love this guy. He smiled broadly at Tom, who gave a small grin in return. Well, we found this in Owen's office. Roxanne showed her father the invoice. He squinted at the paper. Does the clover leaf mean anything to you? She asked. You know, I think this is Owen's building. Roxanne's father looked up from the paper. I remember the day Owen told me he'd bought a building. He was going to expand, he said. When I asked if it was another bar, he said no. He said he was making a brewery, doing a small batch. What do you think happened? Tom asked. I didn't really know. Me and the guys, we sort of forgot about it. Then one day, Owen comes out of his office, mad as a baby who's lost their pacifier. Said something about how he couldn't let all his hard work go up in flames. He burnt down the building? Roxanne said. What do you mean? Her father asked. This address. Roxanne pointed to the street number on the paper. Owen sent me there one night, but all that was left was a burnt-down building. And this, Tom said, showing Roxanne's father the piece of aluminum with the clover leaf logo. I think I've seen this before, her father said, raising his eyes in thought. Yeah, come to think of it, I saw that logo at one of my poker games. Supposedly the guy was a cop. Roxanne looked at Tom knowingly. What did he look like? She asked. Middle-aged, short, beer belly. Her father indicated the belly with his hands. The cop who arrested me, Roxanne said to Tom. That's why Baxter was there at my arrest. They're in on it together. And at some point, Baxter must have been demanding money from Owen. Tom, we need to find out. She stood up, excited to get going on their mission. Whoa there, amateur detective, remember you're pregnant. I think you need to sit this one out. Roxanne had been trying to figure out the puzzle for months, and now she felt one step closer to finding the last few pieces. That kind of information could get her old crew back to work. The fact that Tom wanted her to stop the investigation infuriated her. Maybe it was better that Tom hadn't asked her to move in with him. The way he was acting, she couldn't bear to be placed on the sidelines like an injured player. She wanted to act. Without him watching her, that was just what she planned to do. Chapter 39 The Facts. Roxanne didn't waste any time and called her old boss, Danny, from her apartment the next morning. They planned to meet at the burnt-down building Owen used to own. In the daylight, the building appeared differently than Roxanne remembered. It looked like a heap of rubble, with a little bit of stone foundation left at the bottom, similar to an old castle. Roxanne spotted piles where machinery had probably been, but all of the contents had been removed or stolen. Hey, Danny said, walking into the building. He gave Roxanne a big smile and a wave. Done. How's the kickball team? She asked. It's going okay. Lost in overtime innings last week. Bummer. So why did you invite me here? Danny kicked a pile of pebbles. Look, I know I screwed up. I never should have forged that permit. I'm so sorry I put you and the other guys out of work for the time being, but I think there's more to it than a missing permit. Danny looked up at Roxanne, his eyes clouding a little. They'll be okay. Danny picked up a rock and threw it across the room. Danny shuffled some of the debris with his foot. After he uncovered a piece of silver aluminum, he picked it up and a strange smile formed on his lips. I thought this place was going to be great, he said, still looking at the shiny shard. It could have been too. What do you mean? Roxanne was surprised Danny knew about Owen and the building at all. He looked at Roxanne and took a step closer. Owen was going to start a brewery, bought the building, filed for a permit for some renovations, but Baxter wanted something in return. When Owen refused, poof. He raised his arms indicating the ash around them. Baxter, I knew it, Roxanne said. Yeah, I knew you were onto Baxter when Tom called asking about him. What I didn't anticipate, however, were the lengths you two would go to protect each other. He took another step toward her, looking at her with a mischievous smile. He still held the sharp piece of aluminum between his fingers. Baxter doesn't like to be crossed. He made sure it looked like Owen said it so he couldn't get the insurance money. Paid off the cops though so Owen wouldn't be arrested. He wanted him stewing in his office instead. How do you know all this? Roxanne took a step back. She was getting worried seeing the disdain on Danny's face. The fact that he knew so much information and was stepping closer to her with a sharp piece of aluminum scared her. Danny chuckled at Roxanne like she was a naive child. You still haven't figured it out yet, have you? Roxanne leaned back, thinking about how she could exit if Danny tried to attack her. She wasn't sure what had made his face turn so sinister. Baxter runs this town. You thought you could just shake your hips and he'd sign the permit. What you don't know is that the loan shark you owed money to already paid him off for the permit, Danny said in a disgusted tone. Roxanne didn't like the disdain on Danny's face. His eyes looked dark and beady. She reached in her pocket to feel her phone in case she needed to call for help. I stole that permit. It was me. Danny looked her in the eyes, seething. Roxanne took in a sharp breath. She stood still, ready to run. If Danny had stolen the permit, who knew what else he was capable of? I couldn't let him get away with his schemes any longer, Danny said, clenching his fists. Me and the guys, we do an honest day's work. I can't stand seeing someone like Baxter get away with stealing. Roxanne let out the air in her chest. Danny had wanted revenge on Baxter, not her. But you knew we needed the permit for the construction, she said. Why steal it? I figured the loan shark would go after Baxter once they realized the delay with the permit. I didn't think they'd go after you. And I certainly didn't think you'd resort to forging it. Roxanne relaxed a little when she realized Danny hadn't meant to hurt her. Danny's tension eased as well, throwing the piece of aluminum across the floor. And the clover leaf label? She asked. That was Owen's beer label that Baxter stole. Before he set the fire, Baxter made sure to store the cases of beer that had already been processed in a storage facility. There are still a few cans around. Roxanne thought that made sense. Instead of burning Owen's beer, Baxter just kept it for himself. I've seen Baxter at an abandoned building site and now he's signed a permit for a fake company? He keeps getting bolder. He'd been using abandoned building sites to make more clover leaf cans. Now, he finally took the jump to actually make it a brewery. Danny shuffled some rubble with his feet. Why the illegal company then? He can't sign a permit on his own building. He still wants to be in control. What better way than to run it so no one, at least no one who's legit, knows? That way he can still collect bribes by being a county permit official, and make money from his brewery on the side. Danny looked up and shook his head, remorse settling on his face. Stealing the permit was stupid. I know, but I just didn't want someone like Baxter to keep hurting innocent people. There's still just one loose end that doesn't make sense. Roxanne furrowed her brow, trying to think of an explanation. When I was kidnapped, the loan shark's goons, they had a clover leaf can. If Baxter was trying to get a bribe from the loan shark, why would they have a can of the stolen beer? Danny shrugged. I bet it came from Owen. He gave away some of his first batches before he bought the building. I'm sure it came from there. Roxanne considered Danny's explanation plausible. Now that she knew the details, they needed proof. Even though Danny was unable to bring Baxter down on his own, maybe by joining forces they'd be able to stop him. Don't worry though, said Danny. The loan shark and other investors convinced the county to amend the plans, and they start construction again next week. That's great, Roxanne said. There's just one stipulation the county permit office had. He looked up at the ceiling, unable to meet Roxanne's eyes. What's that? She asked. You're fired. Chapter 40 movie and ready. When Roxanne heard Danny fire her, she snarled. Somehow she knew she wasn't going to go back to work on that project. Not with all the drama surrounding it. Plus, she was helping Tom with the hole in the wall and his project with Ruby, not to mention the pregnancy. Still, being fired from a job, despite the circumstances, made Roxanne feel inadequate. She had worked so hard to have a respectable career in construction, and being a woman made that even more difficult. She wasn't sure she could ever restore her professional reputation. Roxanne, you're a fantastic building site manager. I'm sure Roxanne cut off Danny with a soft groan. She started to feel a cramping pain in her stomach. Sorry, I have to. She bent over with another sudden pain. What is it? Danny said, looking worried. Oh, I didn't tell you the good news, she said, wincing a little. I'm pregnant. She started to walk toward the entrance where she parked her car, her back hunched in an awkward position. Congratulations, Danny said. You're not in labor, are you? It's way too early for that, she said, still working her way to the car. Roxanne could feel something wet between her legs and saw a red stain of blood seep into her pants, and she worried she might lose the baby. When she stumbled on the rubble, Danny grabbed her arm. You're coming with me. They shuffled to his car where he eased Roxanne in. She sat doubled over in pain. At the hospital, the pains worsened. Danny called Tom while they were waiting, and he arrived just before Roxanne saw the doctor, who performed an exam and an ultrasound. Then he gave her a medication that made her a little drowsy but took care of the pain. The baby's fine, the doctor said. It was a kind of hemorrhage. He pointed to an area on the ultrasound screen. What can we do? What happens next? Tom asked, clearly worried. Rest. It will resolve itself. There's a lot more blood come back, but it will probably pass. Less stress is the best medicine in this case. He nodded at Roxanne. She didn't do anything wrong. It just happens in some pregnancies. Nothing to worry about. Tom held Roxanne's hand and looked in her sleepy eyes. You're coming home with me. Roxanne nodded. She couldn't think of any other place she'd rather be. After sleeping for a few hours, Tom brought Roxanne some soup. He propped up the pillows in his king-size bed so she could sit up. Yum. Soup from a can, said Roxanne as she slurped the hot broth. I'm not a good cook, but I try. Roxanne smiled at him. How do you feel? He asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Fine. She sipped more soup. You can't go traipsing around town to abandoned building sites anymore, Roxanne. We're having a baby. She nodded. It wasn't exactly how she wanted the conversation to go. She didn't want to be told what she could and couldn't do. Why? So you can keep an eye on me? Hire a bodyguard to track my every move. I only did that for your safety. She let out a long sigh. And I appreciated it after the kidnapping. She turned to him. But not now. Roxanne, you're too independent. His words hurt, when all she wanted was to rely on him. She could see the frustration on Tom's face by the way his forehead creased and his mouth squeezed at the corners. Please. He softened his face a little. I care about you and our baby. She tilted her head and patted his hand. I know you do. You don't have to have a bodyguard. It's how the house felt so empty without you. Oh really? She asked. I miss you, Roxanne. I miss you in my bed. The way your honey-colored hair fans out on the pillow. The way you leave your bowls on the coffee table. And especially, the way your kisses fill me with a buzzing energy. Roxanne smiled. That's what I want to hear. More of that. She kissed him and kept her face close to his. I don't want to hear what I should or shouldn't do. She placed the soup tray to the side and wrapped her arms around Tom. I want to hear how you'll hold me tight. She started to cry. Oh Tom. I was so scared. First I thought maybe Danny wanted to hurt me. Then I started having cramps, and I didn't know what was going on with the baby, and… Shua, Tom said, trying to soothe Roxanne. I'm here, and I'm not going to let go. Roxanne placed her hands flat on Tom's back, pushing his body to hers. I'm sorry I left last night. It's not that I don't want to live here. Ido. But I wanted you to ask me, not just assume. I'm sorry. I just thought since we put the crib together here and everything that you would… Tom, she interrupted. Roxanne let go of their embrace and looked him in the eyes. Do you want to move in together? Wherever you are is where I want to be, he said and kissed her hard on the lips. I think this place will have to do. She looked around the room and nodded. Tom placed his head on her stomach and listened for the baby. Did you hear that, baby? Mommy and Daddy are moving in together. We can't wait to meet you. There are so many things we want to show you. Tom continued to talk to Roxanne's stomach as she lay back in his bed. He was much more animated and personable talking to their unborn child than when he had conversations with other people. Roxanne mused that he was like a baby whisperer, awkward around others, yet perfectly comfortable with babies. She hoped he would be just as at ease after the baby was born. Lying in bed with Tom, Roxanne couldn't help but be glad about what Danny had done. While it had caused many stressful and dangerous events to occur, it also brought her Tom. And for the first time she knew she was in love. Chapter 41, Party Pain. Roxanne knew that obsessing over those 3 little words was sophomoric. In junior high, people would talk about who loved whom without really giving it a thought as to what those words meant. 6 months after she'd moved in with Tom, he still hadn't told her he loved her. She lay in their bed following an afternoon nap, pregnancy making her more tired than she'd ever been. Looking at Tom's empty side, she wished he was there for her to cuddle. She thought about how he often showed her his affection with kisses and gentle caresses. Moreover, he frequently told her he cared about her. He even showed his feelings for her by buying her gifts such as a foot spa for her swollen feet and giving her nightly foot massages. But he hadn't said, I love you. He probably just assumed she knew it and didn't have to say it, but she wanted to hear it. Rolling over and looking out the window, Roxanne swung her legs off the bed. With her belly growing bigger, sitting straight up had become more difficult. While she still raged about the fact that Baxter continued his illegal dealings, she felt relieved that Danny and her old construction crew were back to work. Albeit, she still needed to find proof of Baxter's misdeeds in order to exonerate Tom for the forged permit. But she was concentrating her efforts on reopening the hole in the wall. Although Tom was busy preparing his development project on Ruby's former land, which he bought, including attending meetings with investors, architects, and city planners, when she had a free moment, Roxanne continued to stew over how to catch Baxter. With the renovations at the hole in the wall complete, the bar was set to reopen that night. Roxanne would have felt most comfortable in her old jeans and a t-shirt, but neither of those fit anymore. Looking down, she couldn't even see her feet over her swollen belly. She shuffled over to the dresser to pick out an outfit for the evening. Tom had been so generous buying maternity clothes and anything else she needed. He also hired a personal chef to make sure Roxanne had healthy meals, and even though she enjoyed being pampered, the pregnancy hadn't slowed her down from working hard to make their projects, such as reopening the hole in the wall, successful. She selected a long cotton dress, her pregnant stomach protruding in the middle, and slipped on a pair of flip-flops so she wouldn't have to contort her body to put on shoes. Plus, the cool air on her exposed, puffy feet felt good. At the hole in the wall, Roxanne met up with her dad, who had also been helping with the reopening preparations. He stood behind the bar making sure the glassware and dishes were ready for use. Roxanne waddled to the bar, her belly leading the way. Bob. How's my favorite pregnant lady? He asked. She put her purse down on the bar. Good, she said. This baby is going to be a soccer player, I think. Kicking away. She held her hands to her stomach and smiled at her father. Hey, do you have any antacids? I think I have a touch of something. He pressed his hand to his chest. She opened her purse and rooted around, finally handing her dad an antacid. Are you sure you're okay? Yeah, he waved. I'm all ready for this place to have some patrons again. You invited all your friends, right? I invited Danny and the construction crew. Plus Tom has some people coming. We should have a good crowd. Roxanne swayed her hips as she scooted over to the bar to check the supplies. While the place had been repaired and cleaned, repainted and upgraded, she'd kept most of the elements that had made it an unpretentious hangout for a diverse crowd. Examining the room, she anticipated a fun and raucous reopening. The staff they'd hired started to arrive, including the new manager. Roxanne left them prepare for the big night, needing to sit down and rest her feet after checking the bar for anything that might be out of place. Tom walked in just before the opening, bringing with him some of his colleagues. Seeing Roxanne at one of the tables, he came over and kissed her on the cheek. "How are you today?" he asked. "Oh, just getting this place set up while our baby here is practicing for the World Cup," Roxanne said with a smirk and rubbed her belly. Tom kissed her burgeoning midsection. "Does it hurt? Why don't you go home? Get some rest? You've been working so hard here." She looked at him with a sly smile. "I love feeling our baby all active and strong. You're not getting rid of me that easy," she said. "I don't care if I have to sit in this chair at the front door like some kind of geriatric welcome wagon. I'm not going anywhere." Tom smiled, and it made her forget all the uncomfortable aspects of her pregnancy. She remembered how his smile on their first outing at the hole in the wall had thrilled her. Even with her tired and awkward body, his smile still renewed her energy. Danny strode in with a few of the guys from Roxanne's old construction site. "Glad you could make it," she said. They looked around, taking in the new surroundings, some giving her a thumbs up, others offering a high five. "I like what you've done with the place," Danny said. "Thanks," Roxanne replied. Ruby glided in a few minutes later wearing a miniskirt and off-the-shoulder blouse. She kissed both Tom and Roxanne on both cheeks and ordered a Chardonnay at the bar. Roxanne eyed a few of the patrons checking her out, including Danny. She made a mental note to introduce them later. The bar buzzed and hummed with drinks and conversation. Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. Roxanne lumbered around to all the tables to thank them for coming, while Tom stayed mostly in the corner, still not totally comfortable with large groups of people. When Roxanne headed to the stockroom to check on some more napkins, she found her dad leaning against one of the shelving units they use for supplies. "Pop, what is it?" she asked. "I think it's just that heartburn I had earlier," he said and winced. She watched him press against his stomach. "I don't think that's it. I'm taking you to the hospital." "You," he chuckled. "You can barely waddle out of here. I may not be able to tie my shoes anymore, but I can drive. Let's go." He grimaced in pain and followed her out the back. Roxanne plodded to the car as best she could with her father hobbling behind her, holding his ailing midsection. Seeing him struggle in pain upset her. In the car, as they passed the hole in the wall, Roxanne could see people laughing and drinking, the atmosphere filled with revelry. While she longed to be there, toasting a beer with her dad, she knew they had to go. Her father's health depended on it. Chapter 42, Botched Baby Moon. Roxanne drove as fast as she could, weaving through various cars to speed to the emergency room. Since she didn't know what was wrong, she didn't know how much time she had before something catastrophic happened to her father, whose groans grew louder as he doubled over in pain. She wanted to drop him off at the emergency room door, but he insisted they park and walk in. Through the parking lot, her father scuttled, hunched over a little, clearly in pain near his waist. Inside, they waited a few minutes before nurses whisked him away in a wheelchair for some tests. Roxanne texted Tom to let him know where she was. Looking down and rubbing her belly, she hoped the doctors could help her father. She wanted her father to be able to meet his grandchild. After a few hours of waiting, Roxanne was able to visit her father. He lay in a hospital bed, looking tired but relaxed. The doctor had given him some pain medicine which made him drowsy, assuring them it hadn't been a heart attack, and her father soon fell asleep. Roxanne stayed by her father's bedside, unwilling to leave, and she fell asleep in a chair. When Tom stopped by the next morning, Roxanne woke up bleary-eyed and groggy. "Roxanne," he said, "you need to go home. You need your rest too." She looked at her father, comfortably sleeping in his hospital bed. "I can't leave yet," she whispered. "I have to know what's wrong." "I'm fine," her father said, waking up and opening his eyes. "They gave me some medicine. It's good. No heart attack." "I told you it was nothing," he said. "I just needed some rest." "Pop, no. It may not have been a heart attack, but something is wrong. You go." "I'll stay," said Tom. "I want what's best for our baby. Your father will understand." She pondered what Tom had said. Lifting her legs, she tried to get a glimpse of her swollen feet. She considered it was probably better if she went home and rested. Okay, but... Before Roxanne could finish, her father's doctor walked in. With curly brown hair like a poodle and glasses, he looked serious. Roxanne grabbed Tom's hand. Mr. Gary, he said, we've run some more tests and I think what was causing your pain was pancreatitis. We need to do some more tests to make sure. If I'm right, we can treat it. He smiled and Roxanne relaxed a little. You hear that? Roxanne's dad said. I'll be fine. Go home. I'll call you a car, Tom said. Roxanne felt so sluggish and decided not to fight with them. A nap at home sounded like a good idea. Roxanne didn't wake up until the next morning. Hi, beautiful, Tom said as he carried in a breakfast tray. He helped Roxanne sit up and sat on the edge of the bed. She took a bite of a Danish and tried to push Tom out of the way. I better get to the hole in the wall, she said. I'm sure it's a mess, and we have to get ready to open and... Tom took her hand. Slow down, he said. Let the manager we hired handle it. You've been asleep for a day. She looked at the clock, surprised at the time. Look, I brought you a surprise. Tom nodded toward the tray. Thanks, Tom. I just better get up and go see my dad. I just called. He's doing well. Now that they have his illness under control, he's going home later today. I hope you don't mind, I hired a nurse to help. Thank you, she gave Tom a small forced smile. But I think he'll want me there. She turned to head toward the bathroom. He'll need medication and food, and I'll probably have to do his laundry. It's all done. I sent over someone for that too, Tom said. Roxanne peeked her head around the door. Well, aren't you the thoughtful one? Roxanne, you need to slow down, Tom said, stepping toward her and taking both her hands in his and pulling her back to the bed. Look! He picked up an envelope from the breakfast tray. I booked us a spa trip at the lake, Tom said. You're too big to fly. It's only 2 hours by car. That way we can head back if your dad really needs us. But I want to spend some time with you before the baby comes. Please? He asked, making a pouty face. They have prenatal massages, he added in his best salesman's pitch. That's really kind of you, she said. It's just... We can stop by and check in on your dad on our way, he said. Roxanne smiled and hugged him. He held her cheeks lightly between his palms and kissed her. It would be their first overnight trip together. A baby moon of sorts. Even though Roxanne was still worried about her father, the thought of getting away with Tom and relaxing appealed to her. Following their visit with Roxanne's father, they arrived at the spa. Inside their room sat a 4-poster bed draped in pristine white linen. The decor reminded her of an English garden with pictures of wild flowers, and the scent of lavender lingering in the air. After sleeping for hours, Roxanne felt eager to get out and explore the premises. Holding hands, she and Tom meandered along a winding path around the forested lake front. The water gleamed from the sun, creating a tranquil glow on the rustic surroundings. Without the stress of worrying about work or loan sharks or stolen permits, Roxanne could embrace the peaceful environment. Due to the pressure of the baby and her swollen feet, she couldn't walk far and suggested they return to their room. Tom obliged and was careful not to walk too fast. They talked about their preferred snacks as kids and the cartoons they watched, planning to introduce their new baby to all their old-school favorites. They rounded the bend, enjoying each other's company, when they saw lightning flash in the darkened sky toward the east. Scurrying faster, they made it back to their room before the downpour hit. Amidst the angry thunder rumbling outside, Roxanne cuddled against Tom's chest, safe and warm. Huddled together, Roxanne thought about how Tom had delivered just what she needed, a quiet, restful chance for them to reconnect. But when Tom's phone dinged, and they received a text about flash flooding at the hole in the wall, they knew their serene retreat was ruined. Chapter 43 Flooding Fears. For the second time in 2 days, Roxanne tried her best to rush to the car, her extra weight making it difficult. Tom helped her in, being extra attentive, and they drove back to the city to save the hole in the wall. When they arrived, water was gushing into the storeroom at the back, as rain poured down on the concrete outside. With the storm drains clogged from debris and falling leaves, the water piled up and forced its way into the back of the bar. Their new manager and some other employees were busy bailing water as fast as they could. However, with each bucket they managed to toss, more water seeped in. Tom ran outside to see if he could clear some of the drains. The rain kept falling and Roxanne felt helpless. Go back and serve the guests, Roxanne told some of the employees as she picked up a pot and started to wade in the water herself. Knee-deep in some places, she started throwing water out the back door. A few minutes later, the rain subsided. Roxanne looked around at the mess pots and pans floating, sludge accumulating around their storage cabinets, and several feet of knee-deep water to contend with. She thought about her dad, glad he was safe at home resting. Had he been there, he would have rolled up his sleeves and joined the crew, which wasn't the best idea at his age. As she dipped the pot into a large pool of water on the floor, she heard a familiar voice ring out. "Y'all better give me a bucket." Roxanne was surprised to find Ruby in the stockroom. "Roxanne," she said in a long drawl, "you best be stopping what you're doing. That baby doesn't need to be wading through this muck." Wearing a pair of sandals and light capri pants, Ruby splashed her way to Roxanne, not caring about ruining her outfit. "What are you doing here?" Roxanne asked, watching as Danny also waded his way in the water. "After your successful opening the other night, I met Danny." She nodded toward him and smiled. "He brought me back here for drinks." Roxanne smirked as she handed Ruby her pot. "You don't have to do this. We can get someone to help." "Nonsense," said Ruby as she and Danny dug in the water and threw it out the opening in the back. "I don't mind getting a little dirty." She winked at Danny, who blushed. "We heard the staff talking about some trouble back here, so we came to check it out." When Tom returned, he took Ruby's pot and relieved her. They were making progress as the water was only ankle deep by then. Ruby sat down next to Roxanne at the far end of the room. "You've got a good one there, you know?" Ruby nodded at Tom. "I know," Roxanne said. "And he's working like mad, trying to make the development project a success." "I know," Ruby said. "And Danny, he's a little rough around the edges." Roxanne thought about how to characterize him. "But he means well, and he knows more than he lets on." Ruby grinned. "He's nothing I can't handle," she said. Roxanne grabbed a beer and a soda from a supply shelf, twisted off the top, and handed the beer to Ruby. "I know it's not your Chardonnay, but it's okay. This feels more like a beer occasion anyway," Ruby said. She turned out to be much different than Roxanne expected. The first time they met, Roxanne saw Ruby as a vapid debutante who was only concerned with old high school gossip, but it turned out that Ruby was a sensible woman with charm and grace who didn't mind getting her hands dirty for a friend. Roxanne thought about how hard it must have been for Owen to take care of problems at the bar alone. He always seemed like nothing ever ruffled him. Yet she knew that couldn't be true. No wonder he wanted to start his own brewery. He'd be less reliant on his suppliers, able to sell his own product. Thinking about his dream being burnt to the ground made Roxanne want revenge. She considered how Owen might have handled the flood and decided he probably would have offered a free round or two of drinks to anyone willing to bail out some water. Her father and a few other guys probably would have taken him up on the offer. Roxanne, however, was glad to find she had friends and a caring boyfriend to help. The men took a break and sat with the ladies on the dirty floor, their hands and bodies muddied by the murky water, while Roxanne retrieved 2 more beers. She looked at the 4 of them, unlikely pals, sitting on the floor of an old familiar bar she never expected to own. "To friends," said Roxanne and held up her bottle of soda. They all clinked them together. It took a few hours, but they were able to get rid of most of the standing water in the storeroom. Numerous places around the city had been affected by the storm. Luckily, Tom was able to secure some fans and equipment to further dry the place, and hired a flood restoration company to repair the damage. After their restful retreat was cut short and they were finished dealing with their emergency, Tom and Roxanne journeyed home, exhausted. They both showered and crawled into bed. "Oh, the baby's moving," she said and brought Tom's hand to her stomach. The baby turned and pushed against Roxanne's skin. Tom felt the pressure against his fingers, and his eyes widened. "Careful in there," he said to the baby. "Don't hurt the woman I love." Roxanne looked over at Tom, her brows furrowed. "Did you just say you love me?" Tom turned his face to hers. "I was going to tell you on our trip to the spa." "Well, it's about time," Roxanne said. He kissed her and stared straight in her eyes. His intensity reminded Roxanne of the night they first met when she had trouble reading his stoic face. "Roxanne, I love you." His face stayed still and serious. "Tom," she said, "I love you too." His face thawed into a radiant smile that beamed warm rays into Roxanne's heart. Slowly, their faces came closer until their lips gently rested together, the sensuous nature of the kiss creating a flurry of movement from the baby. Roxanne could feel Tom's love for both of them inside her. When their faces parted a bit, Roxanne smiled and Tom smiled back, looking happy and relaxed, his earlier nerves having dissipated. Roxanne nestled in his arms, feeling loved and cherished. With the flooding disaster behind them, they could focus on their life ahead. Their baby, the bar, their development deal. She felt like she should be able to relax and enjoy her blissful moments with Tom. However, she couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that she needed to make Baxter pay for his crimes. Chapter 44. Untying Knots. Roxanne tried to push her thoughts of Baxter and vengeance to the back of her mind when she decided to visit her dad the next day. The air felt damp from the rain the night before as she knocked on her father's door, but used her key to enter because she didn't want her father to expend any unnecessary energy for her. He'd received treatment at the hospital and needed to rest, take his medication, and watch his diet in order to avoid any more dangerous flare-ups. Both Roxanne and the people Tom hired were keeping a close eye on him to make sure his condition improved. When Roxanne walked in, she noticed the place looked cleaner and more organized than before, with a gentle smell of lemon wafting in her nose. "Hi, Pop," she said, toddling over to the couch to sit next to him. "Hey, Roxy. Sorry to hear about the bar. I saw on the news there was lots of flooding around town. Wish I could have helped ya." "I know, Pop." She slapped his knee gently. "And then you would have thrown out your back or something. It's probably good you weren't there." "What are you saying? I'm old." He held his chest and gave her a pained look that he quickly turned into a smile. Roxanne nodded. "Yep." She pointed around his place. "This looks good. I see they're taking good care of you." Her father nodded. "The doctor says I'm doing well. That housekeeper Tom sent over is making me some good meals." He patted his stomach. "But I can't keep relying on you guys." "Pop, it's fine. It was Tom's idea. He wants to help." Roxanne didn't want her father to worry. "Roxanne, you've helped out your old dad enough. I mean, I never should have gambled all that money." He frowned, remembering his blunder. "That's behind us. The loan shark is going to get his money plus some. Don't worry. I need you to focus on getting healthy, so you can be the coolest granddad around." She rubbed her hands around her stomach and smiled. "Tom's a fine man. I hope it works out between you two." Her father grinned, then pushed himself up off the couch and ambled to his bedroom. When he arrived back next to Roxanne, he held out a silver necklace with a Celtic knot charm hanging on the chain. "This was your mother's. I want you to have it." "Dad, this is really special." Roxanne held the necklace in her hand, running her finger over the charm. "If you had this all along, why didn't you try to sell it? You could have gotten good money for this." He waved his hand at her. "It's too important. Your mother used to wear it all the time. I didn't buy it for her, but I used to clasp it around her neck nearly every morning." He looked wistful, talking about the memory. "Her hair, it smelled like coconut. I loved that smell." He turned to Roxanne. "When she left, she didn't take it. I think she meant for you to have it." "Thanks, Pop." Roxanne felt emotional that her father was willing to part with an important item of her mother's. It made her remember how important family was to her. "Not much more time now and you'll have your little one," he mused. "I knew it would happen one day. For all your toughness, you've got a big heart. You've been taking care of me these last few years, so I know you'll be a great mom." He shuffled to the kitchen and offered Roxanne a green juice. "Tom's helper makes it and it's delicious. She left me some in the refrigerator." "I guess it's better for you than beer," Roxanne laughed. He laughed a little too. "I'm getting back to my job at the bar in no time. Helping you guys out is the least I could do. And anytime you need a babysitter, here I am." He walked back to the couch with the juice and handed it to her. Roxanne wished she felt as confident as her father. She still had so much to do to prepare for the baby, but all she could think about recently was how to catch Baxter. Her problem was like a knot she couldn't untie. She looked again at the charm. It clearly meant a lot to her father to have kept it for so many years. The Celtic emblem reminded her of other Irish symbols, like the clover leaf. She took a sip of the green juice and a crazy idea popped into her head. "Sorry, Dad. I have to go," he finished. "I understand." She stood up, kissed him on the cheek and hurried to the car. But first she needed to visit Danny. Compared to the quiet, peaceful construction site the night she saw the cat, the building location looked like a different place, buzzing with action. Cranes and trucks whirred around, dropping supplies and dirt in various directions. Men with hard hats yelled directions and the sound of metal clanging created a hum around the site that Roxanne missed. She found Danny, busy dealing with a broken crane. "Hey, Roxanne," he said. Done. "I don't mind or anything, but you know you're not supposed to be here." He signaled to the crane operator to start the engine, and it whirred to life. "I know, it's just that. I was thinking. You said you stole the permit Baxter signed, right?" She bit her lip, nervous he had destroyed it. "Yeah." He started to walk toward another machine as Roxanne followed, trying to keep up. "Well, where did you put it?" she called to his back. He pointed toward his trailer. "Stashed away in my office someplace. Why?" "I think I can use it for evidence." Roxanne's mind whirred with thoughts about catching Baxter. And do you know if that building where Baxter was going to make beer for his illegal company is producing any product yet? No, they're still working on it. The construction network in this town is pretty small, as you know. He turned to look at her and stopped walking. A man driving a dump truck waved to Roxanne and she waved back. So the only stash of that clover leaf beer should be what was stolen from Owen? She asked. Should be, he said and shrugged. He gave her a skeptical look as if trying to figure out where she was going with the interrogation. Look, I have a plan. Do you think you can help? She asked. Danny cocked his head and Roxanne held her breath for a second, unsure if he would agree. After all, his own plan had gone awry and almost cost him his job. Then a mischievous smile formed on his lips. I'll do whatever it takes to catch that bastard, he said, and Roxanne realized without a doubt that Danny would help with whatever outlandish scheme she cooked up if it meant a chance to punish Baxter. Chapter 45 Beer Can Shake Up. Once Roxanne convinced Danny to get on board with her plan, she called Ruby. She needed someone attractive to distract Baxter. Roxanne assured Ruby she would meet him in a public place, so he couldn't try anything like he did with Roxanne. Still, she worried Baxter wouldn't fall for their scheme. Roxanne needed to give Baxter a good reason to unload his stash of cans in order for her idea to work. Based on what Danny had told her, Baxter would pretty much do anything for money and a pretty face. Somehow Roxanne thought they needed a way to get Baxter to the warehouse where he kept the stolen beer and follow him there. But first she wanted to toy with him a little. She had Ruby call Baxter, pretending to be a beer distributor. Ruby told him she happened to run across a new beer in a clover leaf can that she was eager to sell to her clients. When Baxter asked where she found it, Ruby expertly brushed off his question and instead focused on charming Baxter just enough that he agreed to meet the following day. On a cloudy afternoon, Roxanne, Tom, and Danny stood outside the country club, waiting for Ruby to secure them access to the grounds. Tom held a case of Owen's clover leaf beer. A few days before, when Roxanne had divulged her plot to Tom after securing her supporting cast, he had been skeptical, but after making Roxanne promise she wouldn't put herself or the baby in danger, he agreed to her strategy. Once they received the all-clear from Ruby, they scampered around the clubhouse to the doors that led into the restaurant from the golf course. Tom placed the case of cans at their feet as Ruby installed herself at a table inside. They figured Baxter would enter from the inside due to his scheduled meeting with Ruby. Roxanne hid behind a bush outside so she would have a good sightline to their table. The case of beer she found in Owen's office would come in handy in order to carry out their ploy, but only if Ruby could be convincing. At the scheduled time, Baxter sauntered up to Ruby and shook her hand. It's nice to meet you, Ruby said, extending her hand in return. And you too, Baxter smiled wide, his eyes feasting on Ruby's figure for a moment before sitting down. He ordered 2 drinks, smiled and chuckled with Ruby, while she smiled back and flicked her hair. Here's my card. Ruby handed a fake business card to Baxter. Thanks to Tom, who had one of his employees produce a fake business card and contract, Ruby's ruse would look legitimate. Baxter picked it up and held it in his hand, then leaned forward on the table. He seemed more interested in Ruby than the business deal, and didn't pay much attention to the card. What's a pretty woman like you doing in beer distribution? Baxter asked. Ruby giggled. I like to meet all kinds of people, and I'm good at it. I bet you are, Baxter said and leaned back, still eyeing her. I hope you don't mind, but I wrote up a contract already. You see, I hear you aren't the only one with access to the beer I want, so if you want to make this official, sign here. Her face released into a demure grin, and she pushed the contract across the table. From what Roxanne could tell, Ruby looked to be doing well, alternating between more serious business discussion and casual flirting. At one point she even grazed Baxter's hand, which Roxanne could tell sent Baxter in a tizzy. He seemed so taken with Ruby and the opportunity to make more money off his stolen cache of beer cans. He didn't notice Danny walk in sipping from one of the beer cans Roxanne had found in Owen's office. Meanwhile, Tom and Roxanne started to hand out free beers bearing the clover leaf logo from Owen's reserved stash to all the golfers and country club patrons who entered the room. In the next couple of minutes, while Baxter was talking to Ruby, nearly a dozen men and women walked into the bar area with a clover leaf can. At one point, Roxanne saw Baxter look quizzically at one of the cans before turning back to Ruby. Roxanne could see he was starting to squirm in his seat, not knowing where the cans were coming from. Just when he started to get a little too flirty with Ruby, placing his hand atop hers, Tom walked in carrying the clover leaf beer. Baxter recognized him immediately and stared. Tom sat down at the table next to Baxter and waved. Roxanne was used to seeing Tom stilted and stoic, But in that moment Tom relaxed in his seat, his back curved to the chair, an impish grin on his face. Baxter, on the other hand, grew stiff and concerned, his jaw tightening as he scanned the room. At nearly every table, someone was sipping from a clover leaf beer. Baxter was inundated. Like a horror movie, the one thing Baxter coveted multiplied before his eyes. He tried to make eye contact with Ruby, but he kept looking around at all the cans. His uncertainty grew as Ruby questioned him. "Is anything wrong?" she asked in her sweet southern accent. "No, it's—" Baxter blinked and wiped his eyes, unsure what to say or do. Finally, Roxanne walked in carrying an unopened can, her gravid state making each step heavy and deliberate as she approached Baxter, shaking her can. When she reached the table, she slammed down the beer and cracked it open, spraying the liquid on Baxter's face and chest. "That was for Owen," she said. Baxter looked stunned. His eyes blinked from the liquid as he wiped some droplets off his cheek. He shook his hands to rid them of the excess fluid. Roxanne could tell he didn't know how to respond. A moment later, Baxter stood up, towering over Roxanne. He cocked the beer in his hand as if he was about to throw it at her. His eyes bored into her, but she held her ground, staring back. Tom jumped to his feet. "Hey, Baxter." A crony of Baxter's approached from behind and slapped him on the back, his other hand holding a clover leaf beer. "This is pretty good." He raised the can a little higher. "You should try it." He wobbled a little, revealing his drunken state and unawareness of the contentious situation. Baxter curled his lip in disgust. "Who are these ladies?" the friend asked, raising his eyebrows at Roxanne and Ruby. "She was just leaving," Baxter snarled, nodding at Roxanne. The tension grew as their standoff started to attract attention from some of the other patrons. Roxanne glanced around, pleased to see dozens of people with clover leaf cans surrounding them. Not wanting to cause any more of a scene, Roxanne turned on her heel and walked away. Being pregnant, she knew Baxter wouldn't try to attack her, not with so many people in the room drinking from the same cans where Baxter couldn't tell who was a friend and who was an enemy. Satisfied that she'd at least unsettled him, Roxanne and her crew prepared for the second part of her plan. Operation Beer Can Shake Up was a success. Next came the hard part: catching Baxter with the goods.